Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Amanda, and I'm coming to you live from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. Now, today we are going to be exploring more about jellies and plankton. Now, if you would like to text in any questions you have, or if you make observations along the way, we invite you to contact us at the number you see on your screen at 286-1838. And you're welcome to text us any questions. And I have two helpers with me here. I have Alicia, who's operating the camera and the screens behind me, as well as Stacy, who will be getting your text questions and sending those our way so that we can answer them live for you. However, if you're watching this at a later time and it's not live, you can still text in, or email in any questions that you have by emailing us at live@lbaop.org. That's LB for Long Beach, AOP, Aquarium of Pacific.org. All right, well, let's get started. As you look behind me, you'll notice we have some very interesting organisms swimming around, and you are probably familiar with them. Now, you may have heard them called two different names. You may have heard us refer to them as sea jellies, or you may have also called them jellyfish. But we're going to learn a little bit more about what's different from these particular organisms and fish, which is why we call them sea jellies rather than jellyfish. Same organism, just a different common name that we're using. So as you're looking at them, let's look. Go ahead, and what do you notice about them? How are they different than fish? Obviously, you can see right through them. They don't have bones. It's very obvious that they don't have bones in their body. So that's one big difference between them and a fish. Now, they also have an interesting way of moving. They don't move with fins. They have no fins like fish. Instead, they're basically just going like this, using their bell. This round part of the jelly is what we call the bell, and that's what they're using to move. And you're going to notice their way of going to get food is going to be very different too. And you probably know some of the things that they use to grab their food. And we'll dive into that a little bit deeper later. But let's talk about some of the foundation. We said we're talking about jellies and we're talking about plankton. So let's put this on hold for a minute as we think about what plankton is. Or actually, I should say what plankton are, because the word plankton is actually a plural word. It refers to more than one. If you're talking about one individual organism that you might think of as plankton, we would actually call that a plankter. So one plankter or two or more plankton. So what are plankton? How would you define it? Many times people think about plankton being very, very small. And, you need a microscope to see it. Very small microscopic organism or single cell organisms. And that can be true. But plankton can also be a little bit larger than microscopic. Do you have any idea how large plankton can be? I'm kind of curious to know. I might even wait to see if I get any responses. How big do you think plankton can be? Is it like this big? Would that still be considered plankton, or would that be too large to be plankton? Or what about this big? This big. Could it be as big as me? Kind of curious. Just kind of want to know your thoughts. So as you're answering and letting us know what you think how big plankton can be, let's talk a little bit more about plankton, because there's two different kinds of plankton. Some plankton you may have thought of as, well, SpongeBob, right? I've heard about plankton from SpongeBob. And believe it or not, that plankton is a real type of plankton. It's modeled after a real plankton called a copepod. And a copepod is a type of an animal. So there's animal plankton, like copepods, and then there's also, and here's a nice example of a copepod. So do you see how he's got this kind of thick body here, and then he's got these two long antennae that come out the top, and then right in the middle, right there, that is an eye, one big eye right in the middle. So copepods are probably the most abundant type of these animal plankton that are in the ocean, and they're very, very commonly seen around our coast here. Now, they are something that can be seen with the naked eye if you look really, really carefully. But again, most of the time it's going to be too small and you would not notice. But if you look carefully, if you use a plankton net to collect one, you could. And that might be something that I could ask and see if maybe one of our helpers might be able to have help me locate a plankton net because I didn't think about bringing one of those into our studio. But it would be neat to see how we actually collect plankton. So if we have an opportunity, we'll see if we can show that to you later as well. Okay, so there are some things that are coming in, some questions. And Gage wants to know, can some jellies migrate? Now that's a really interesting question because yes, jellies can move in big groups and they basically follow the sun. However, they can't follow it very well on their own. They need the help of the ocean currents to take them. And that actually gets to be how we define plankton. So we mentioned, I asked you to think about how big it can get. Is it this big or is that too big? Or is it small? Well, plankton is actually not defined by size. So even though microscopic things in the water can be plankton, like this copepod, which is normally very, very small, they can also be very, very large. They could actually be much larger than me because plankton isn't defined by size. Instead, it's something that floats at the mercy of the ocean's currents. So that is what defines plankton. And thank you, Stacy. Stacy has brought in an example of my plankton net. Thank you for doing that. So I want to show you here how we would collect it. Now, this is obviously an example of how we would collect smaller plankton. So we'll get to the larger plankton in just a minute. We just saw that picture of a sea jelly. Sea jellies are an example of a larger type of plankton that's very visible with the naked eye. But what about the smaller ones? Well, this is actually a net called a plankton net that's made of a very fine material, a very fine mesh that the water is able to get through. But then at the very end, we put on a container like this. So we would unscrew the lid, put this here on the end. It would screw in, which this one isn't fitting right now. But then we drop this into the water and we allow the water to flow through this. And as the water flows through it, the water gets out, but any plankton gets collected in that bottom container at the very, very end of it. And then we can bring it on up and see what kinds of things we have inside. And it's going to be hard to see it through this, but when we pour it into a little dish and look at it under a microscope, we'll be able to see what kinds of things we collected. And I actually have some plankton that we collected that we'll be looking at in just a little bit. And we'll see the difference between how it looks with the naked eye versus how it looks under a more magnified view of it. So we know that plankton can be animals, but did you know that plankton can also be plants? Now, this picture is an example of a type of plant plankton that we call diatoms, and actually plant plankton in general we refer to as phytoplankton. So this is phytoplankton, and phytoplankton are the tiny plants that are living in the ocean. And if you think about what plants on land do, they create energy from the sun and they create oxygen for us to breathe. And that's exactly the same thing that these phytoplankton in the ocean do. So they are pulling in energy from the sun and creating oxygen that goes into the ocean for the animals that are in there, but it also comes into the air for us to breathe. So every time you take a deep breath of air, just take that big deep breath and let it out. You can thank the plankton in the ocean because there's different estimates to how much exactly of the oxygen we're breathing that's being produced by these plankton, but it's a good portion of it. So somewhere between, some people have said maybe as low as 50% and as high as even 80%. So a lot of the oxygen is produced by these plankton. So these are called phytoplankton. Phyto are the plant plankton. Then we have the zooplankton, which is what we were talking about earlier, the animal plankton. So this is a copepod, an example of zooplankton. And if you think about it, you go to the zoo to see animals, right? So zoo means animal, and the phyto is the plant plankton. Now there's also something in between I'll mention, something called dinoflagellates. And dinoflagellates are like plants that can swim. So they can actually propel themselves, but they're more like plants in the water. So kind of interesting unicellular organisms. But let's talk a little bit more about what else these, we have the plant plankton that are producing oxygen for us and the animals in the ocean to breathe, but there's also something else that they can do. Think about what other things do plants provide for us? Besides oxygen that we breathe, they're a source of food. So phytoplankton are a source of food for some of those other plankton we were looking at earlier, the copepods. But then they also can be eaten by other organisms. So those zooplankton can be eaten by other zooplankton and even other fish in the ocean. So plankton in general is the basis of the food chain in the ocean. And very, very important, not just for us in breathing, but also all the organisms, even all the way up to the blue whale. And here's an example of a type of plankton that is commonly fed to many of our animals here at the aquarium. So this right here, he looks like he's got cute little googly eyes. This is a type of zooplankton that we refer to as brine shrimp. And I have an example of some brine shrimp right over here. Now, I'll bring this over in front of the camera here first. So you can see I have this small little container. It doesn't really look like much. There's just a little bit of water in here. And I'll show you on my camera in just a minute. You can see it looks kind of orange, but we're going to take a closer look at that orange. So, do you see all those little specks that are moving around in there? Well, those are all little baby brine shrimp. And I'm going to zoom in, and we're going to get a little bit closer view. Do you see all of that moving around in there? I'm going to try and see if I can get even closer. Maybe if I take a pipette and I pull some out, maybe we'll see if we can make it a little bit easier to see. Here, I'm going to swap it out for this one. All right, now, let's see how close we can get. Is that going to come in focus? They might be moving around too much. I'll back out a little bit. But these are these little tiny baby brine shrimp, just like that picture that we showed you earlier, that really funny looking one with the, looks like googly eyes. Whoa, there's a lot of them here. A high concentration of these little tiny plankton. And again, if I was to zoom out and show you, this is actually just a drop of water, basically from my pipette. And here's that bigger container here. But you can see how their numbers make the water almost look orange right here and on that one side. But then they're all there's hundreds of animals in there. And this is commonly fed to our animals here at the aquarium that have very small mouths we can't chop up fish small enough for them to eat. So if you think about animals with small mouths, you might think of animals like a seahorse. There are lots of little baby fish larvae. So look at that tiny mouth of the seahorse. And when they eat, they suck in their food. They eat little brine shrimp. They also sometimes will eat mysid shrimp, but really small animals that they just suck in very quickly. And it's actually, here's another example. This is a sea dragon that is fed mysid shrimp. And so we can collect mysid shrimp for them. We can actually grow them here at the aquarium. But they have those long tube-like mouths right there in the end. So that's an example of another animal that eats brine shrimp. But believe it or not, brine shrimp are also eaten by other plankton like our sea jellies. So they're commonly fed to our sea jellies at the aquarium here. And it's actually kind of interesting how they eat. When we feed them their food, we pour it in what looks like a pitcher of Kool-Aid almost, right? That sort of orange color. And then we just kind of pour it into the water so that the jellies just float through it. Now I want you to think about how they're able to find their food. Do they have regular eyes? Well, not regular in the way that you and I have regular eyes that we can see faces, but they do have eye spots, and they're called ocelli, and they're located around the edges in certain areas. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have a really good view on this picture, but there's kind of like these little scalloped edges, and where they kind of come up, those are the places where they have these little tiny spots that will allow them to detect light. So remember how we said that jellies like to move towards the sun? They can actually do that. And it would kind of be around these areas, like right around here, where it kind of the edge of the bell of the jelly kind of comes up a little bit. But there's also something else that's really fascinating in those areas. And they have these crystals that grow in this little circle, and they float around. And when they float around, it allows a jelly to tell what way is up and what way is down, and it helps them to orient their bodies to gravity. So it's kind of like how your inner ear works and how we can keep our balance and know what's what because of little hairs that we have inside of our ears. Well, jellies don't have exactly little hairs, but they do have this little crystal that goes around in this little teeny tiny ball. And so as they turn this way and the crystal goes on that end of that little circle, then that gives them an idea of like, okay, that crystal is always going to be down where the gravity is pulling it down. So it helps them orient themselves upright. So another thing that jellies will do, they'll orient themselves according to the water flow. So you look at these, you can actually see the jellies, kind of an upside down view of them, which is really cool to see because oftentimes we see them just with the bell on the top. You kind of wonder what's going on inside of there. So you can kind of see the underside of the bell as the jelly is moving. And you see those long tentacles coming up? Well, actually, do you know what you're looking at? What part are the tentacles? When you look at this animal, there are some dark spots coming up, and then there's also this white, sort of fluffy stuff in the middle. And here's a nicer picture of it, easier to differentiate the two. So there's this white stuff here, and then there's also these long strands. So which ones are the tentacles, do you know? Well, the tentacles are the long, skinny ones coming down from the edge of the bell of a jelly. All this frilly stuff that you see coming down in the middle that looks kind of lacy, those are what we call the oral arms. Oral meaning mouth and arms, well, arms. So these are the mouth arms. So the tentacles, what's so special about them? I'm sure you know. You've heard about why you wouldn't want to give a big hug to a sea jelly if you found one, right? It would be a very painful experience because they have stinging cells. So on each one of these tentacles, they have stinging cells that allow them to grab and shoot out basically like little arrows almost to anything that will allow them to that attaches onto them or that brushes by them, they can attach onto and bring it up to the underside where their mouth is and where their stomachs are. And notice I said stomach. So sea jellies have more than just one stomach. A lot of times they have 4, but oftentimes they have more. Now, this is a great example to see where the stomachs are. If you look at the top, you see that sort of darker white area. It's kind of weird to say dark white. But right here, you see those 4 little shapes? They look like little flower petals, kind of. Those are where the stomachs would be. That's also where all their reproductive organs are, where they can produce their eggs and sperm. So right here, those are the stomachs. And these right here are the oral arms on the inside. So those kind of wide things. Now this particular jelly here is called a moon jelly. And moon jellies have very short tentacles and longer oral arms. So if you look really carefully along the edge of the bell, remember that's where we said the tentacles are. You can kind of see them there. Now again, these are the oral arms. But right at the edge, they almost look like long wispy eyelashes. And those are the tentacles in the moon jellies. Now, moon jellies don't have very long tentacles and they're not very strong, which is why here at the Aquarium of the Pacific, we actually have a moon jelly touch lab where you can touch the jellies gently and see what they feel like. Now, the jellies at that touch lab are the moon jellies because they don't have a strong sting. We would not allow you to touch jellies that could potentially hurt you. You wouldn't want to touch a sea nettle like this one. It would be a very unpleasant experience. But when you think about what they eat, moon jellies, we feed the baby brine shrimp. So those tentacles don't have to be very strong to be able to grab that plankton, that small little tiny plankton, and bring it up to eat it. Whereas these guys might be eating fish and maybe even other jellies. And so those tentacles are a little bit stronger and the sensation would be a lot greater. So I would not encourage you to ever touch a sea jelly if you come across one. Even if you see one washed up on the beach, they can still have tentacles with stinging cells that could deliver a pretty powerful punch. So keep your distance from sea jellies when you see them. All right, now someone also asked a question, is a Portuguese man-of-war a type of plankton? Now that's actually a really interesting question because Portuguese jellies, they look very similar to how we think of this animal, thinking of it as a jellyfish, sea jelly, except they're a little bit different. They don't actually have the same structure all in one. They're actually a group, kind of a colony of animals living together with different specialized features to them. And they would be considered a type of plankton because they're drifters and they go wherever the ocean current takes them. So yes, they are considered plankton, but they're not a real true jelly. They're in a kind of a different category of jelly. Now, jellies are in this group or a phylum that we call cnidarians or cnidaria. And cnidarians include animals with stinging cells, and it also includes anemones. So think about anemones. This one right here. And you can see it's kind of like an upside down jelly in a way because its tentacles are facing up, right? So these are all of its tentacles. And if you ever touched a sea anemone, you'll notice they feel a little bit sticky. And that's because they're actually stinging you when you touch them. But their sting, again, is not very strong and it doesn't hurt us. But then all they have to do is bring it to that middle opening, just like the underside of the jelly has that opening that goes up to its stomachs. So this is where the opening for the anemone is and where its mouth is. So anemones are considered cnidarians, but they're in a different sort of group, a different class. They're anthozoans, whereas true jellies are scythozoans, if I'm saying that right. And then we also have Hydra Medusa and hydrozoans and other animals that are very, very similar, or like ctenophores, which are animals that look very gelatinous like jellies, but again, they don't have the stinging cells, the same stinging cells, and they don't operate and move. They don't have the same body structure that these other jellies do. When we have a video, we can even show you. Let me see. I think this is going to be a comb jelly. Now, comb jellies are really interesting because when they move, you might see what looks like rainbows. Do you see any rainbow coloring? Maybe you don't notice it as well, but kind of going up and down. Do you notice that looks a little bit different? Their body shape looks different than the sea jellies that we were looking at. They don't really have a bell. Instead, they have lobes. So they're kind of see-through like the jellies are. So they are gelatinous, but they just don't have the same body shape. They have these lobes instead. And their way of getting around isn't by moving a bell up and down. Instead, it's by using these little cilia. So they have these almost like little hairs that go all the way up and down along their lobes that as they move, it looks like they're creating light. Well, they're not actually making their own light. They're not bioluminescent organisms, but they do move in such a way that it takes the light that's hitting them and bends it like a prism. So sometimes you can see like a red, orange, yellow, green, blue, all the colors of the rainbow all going up and down along this creature's body. So it's a pretty interesting animal, but not a true sea jelly like we were talking about. Someone also asked, a good observation is that plankton can be as big as 1 inch. And that's, I think, what most people think of as the outer size limit of plankton, about 1 inch. But as we know now, plankton can be something like a sea jelly because plankton isn't defined, or they are not defined by size, but rather something that's at the mercy of the ocean's current. So sea jellies. And did you know the largest sea jelly is the lion's mane sea jelly, and it can get tentacles that are 100 feet long. So it can be very, very large, much larger than microscopic, yet it's still considered plankton because it can't move against an ocean current. If the ocean current is taking it this way and it's trying its best to swim, moving that bell the other way, it's not going to be successful. So that's something that defines plankton. That's how plankton is defined. All right. Well, I wonder if we have any other pictures of jellies, maybe that we haven't had a chance to see yet. Oh, here we have a crystal jelly. Now, this is another fascinating jelly because it has something that's really important to us today. It has something called GFP, which is green fluorescent protein. So it has the ability to create fluorescence. So it's actually, it looks like it's emitting light. As long as light is shining on it, it can glow this beautiful green color. And scientists have learned that they can use that for helping treat people and track things in our own bodies, and learning more about DNA and genetics by looking at things inside our own bodies under the right lighting that they can see in new ways. So we're learning more about ourselves because of what we're learning and discovering about things in the ocean, like these crystal jellies. So they're really pretty. They're not very large jellies, but I know the ones we've had here have have been, relatively small. But they're really, really pretty. But you can see that bell, and you can see all their tentacles that are coming up. There's another type of jelly, I don't believe we have a picture of it, that are called red-eye Medusa, or red eyes. And they have along the edge of their belly, around the edge of their bell, they have little red eye spots where those ocelli are. And they're very beautiful and look a little bit different from other sea jellies because you're not used to seeing those bright red spots in those areas. But oh, here's a lagoon jelly, this white-spotted lagoon jelly. Notice how this one doesn't look quite as see-through. It's actually got some color to it, and it's kind of like this brownish, orangish color. And that's really important for this animal because it has another organism living inside of it, and it's called Zooxanthellae. And Zooxanthellae is what is taking the energy from the sun, just like those other plankton in the water, and they are the phytoplankton, that is, and they are creating color and food for this jelly. So this white-spotted lagoon jelly has Zooxanthellae, giving it the kind of orangish or yellowish brownish sort of color inside of them. But look at how different they look. So like their little oral arm area, and you can't see some of the tentacles that are hanging down here, but really, really pretty with those white spots, very easy to identify. Let's see. So we've talked about plankton not being limited by size, but just something that can't swim against the ocean. We talked about the fact that there is plant plankton called phytoplankton and zooplankton called, or animal plankton called zooplankton. Now, also, one other thing I didn't mention is that not all plankton stays plankton its whole entire life. Some plankton will grow up to be like a fish. Did you know that a lot of fish start off life as plankton? In fact, most fish start off life as plankton because it's something, they're in eggs. They hatch out of eggs that are so tiny that they can't possibly swim against an ocean current. So they go wherever that ocean current takes them. And so even in this exhibit, if you look carefully, right down there at the bottom, right behind this little flowing seaweed, there is a little fish down there. And that is our baby giant sea bass. Now, it might not look very giant to you, but this is what it looked like. This is the baby picture of our giant sea bass. And this baby was born from two of our giant sea bass in our Blue Cavern exhibit here at the aquarium. And we were really excited because this was the first time a public aquarium had ever had success in growing a little baby giant sea bass to this size. Now, it's hard to tell, but this picture, this animal is probably about this big when that picture was taken. Now the animal is probably about this big and is in our Amber Forest exhibit that we were just looking at there. But we could probably show you the exhibit where maybe one day it will be with its parents, if we can find a spot where we can see the giant sea bass. Oh, there we go. Now it looks a lot more giant, right? So there's the big mouth of our giant sea bass. You could see some of the leopard shark swimming in the background. So this is, not to disappoint, the giant sea bass. And believe it or not, this animal started off life as a plankton. Here's another one that's swimming by down there. So this large animal, which can be about 500 pounds or so, started off as a plankton. So kind of interesting. And these animals that start off as plankton and then outgrow it when they can swim against an ocean current are what we call meroplankton. So it's M-E-R-O plankton, meroplankton. And I'm cracking up by this big... So here's another example. This little tiny octopus here. When octopuses are born, they're born really, really tiny. But then as they get bigger and they can hold on to things and withstand those ocean currents, they would be considered nekton. But that's a word nobody ever uses. But nekton are the organisms that can swim against an ocean current, like this big giant sea bass here, or whales and dolphins and things like that. Those other plankton, remember the copepod that we saw earlier and the brine shrimp that we were looking at, even when the brine shrimp get big, they won't get to be very large and they'll still be plankton. Those are plankton their whole lives and we call those holoplankton. Their whole lives, holoplankton. So just kind of some interesting things that you may have taken for granted when you think about the ocean and you think about what's there. We oftentimes focus on the large animals that we can see very clearly, or even the big tall seaweed and think, oh wow, think of all the oxygen that that's producing. But we seldom think about the plankton that's in the water that you can't see, or even recognize that there is much larger plankton in the water that maybe you see very easily, but you didn't realize were actually plankton, like the sea jellies. So hopefully you appreciate plankton a little bit more, realizing that there's a lot of it here, even if you don't see it. There's a lot of plankton in that water, and we're feeding plankton, and it's feeding all these organisms too. So those smaller ones get eaten by the larger ones, which get eaten by larger organisms in the fish, and like I said, even the big blue whales feed on plankton. So they are a very, very important part of the marine ecosystem, and a very important part of our daily lives too. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining us again. And again, if you had any other questions that you wanted to email us, if you're watching this at a later time, you can email live@lbaop.org, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. So have a wonderful day, everyone. Goodbye.